All right, today we start Unit 6, which is on the 19th century. This unit is going to cover from 1815, kind of the fall of Napoleon and the end of the War of 1812, where we left off last unit, and it's going to go all the way to the end of the 1800s, the end of the 19th century. So this unit's going to be a little bit bigger, got a couple more pages in your packet because we cover a lot of time and a lot of events, a lot of people during this unit, but this is going to carry us up to Christmas. So this is going to be our last unit, before the final. Okay, and this is going to be on the 19th century. Today we're going to be learning about the United States between the War of 1812 and the Civil War. We're going to learn lead up to that, and then we're going to be spending a day on the Civil War a little bit later. All right, so from 1815 until 1860, what was going on in the United States? That's what we're going to be tackling today. First thing to talk about is the Market Revolution. This was the time between the end of the War of 1812 and the beginning of the Civil War, when you have all these new innovations, all these new developments that are really changing the American economy in a really big way. You have new inventions like telegraphs, steamships, railroads being built, all these different things that are really improving both trade and transportation. The economy was really booming throughout a lot of this time period. You have roads being built, you have factories being invented really at this time. And this really shifted the U.S. from a society based on subsistence agriculture, which means your entire day is spent farming and growing food for your family. It shifted the U.S. from a society like that to a society where people actually worked outside of the home in large numbers, even women. You have a lot of people working in factories, earning money, and then buying stuff with that money, instead of simply growing their food and that being what they do for work. So we learned about the first four presidents last unit. We learned about George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison. Okay, we will be learning about every single president, a little bit about each one in this class. So today we're going to start with James Monroe. He was the fifth president. That's where we're picking up here in the late 1810s. And he, as our fifth president, signed something called the Missouri Compromise. This was a really important piece of legislation that he signed, and this forbid slavery north of the southern border of Missouri. It's known as the 3630 parallel. All right, so that's also the border between Tennessee and Kentucky, the border between Virginia and North Carolina. And what this did was it said that slavery was not going to expand all that much out west, because our country was really growing westward at this time. You had a lot of people settling west of the Mississippi River. And a big problem was this issue of slavery. Are we going to continue to have this? When is it going to be abolished? At this time, most northern states had already abolished slavery, and so they wanted it to be abolished completely, of course. And this was kind of a compromise here with the Missouri Compromise, saying, okay, slavery is going to still exist for a while at least, but it's not going to expand past this line. It's not going to exist north of this geographical line. Now, Monroe's time in office was called the Era of Good Feelings. It's what people called it. It was a time of a lot of unity in America for the most part. People agreed on most political issues. The big exception was slavery. Throughout the first 80 years of the United States, slavery was the issue. It was the dividing issue between people in the United States. Everyone had an opinion about it. Things usually got very heated. Sometimes people would get killed over an argument over that issue. Now, the most important thing that James Monroe did, is he signed something called the Monroe Doctrine. This was Monroe's foreign policy. The Monroe Doctrine is a really important term to know, especially when you get to U.S. history, really big on the U.S. history state test. What the Monroe Doctrine did is it closed the Americas to further colonization. Remember how I said that the New World, the Americas used to entirely be owned by Europe, and then by around 1830, Europe had lost nearly all of their land in the Americas because of the American Revolution and then all the Latin American revolutions, and they had lost pretty much all of their land. And President Monroe said that's how it should be. That's how it should be. Europe should stay in their hemisphere. They should stay on their side of the Atlantic Ocean and not come over here into the Americas anymore. Okay? He said that European countries were not to interfere in matters of the Western Hemisphere. They were not to try to colonize the Americas anymore. And in return, Monroe promised that America would not interfere in Europe or in their colonies elsewhere, like in the Pacific and places like that, or in Asia. So this was kind of a trade-off saying, okay, Europe, your hemisphere is the Eastern Hemisphere, our hemisphere is the West, and we're not going to encroach upon each other there. So if you see in that political cartoon there, it's like a line was drawn in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean by Monroe, and he said, we're going to stay on our sides of the ocean. Now, this policy supported Latin American independence and also American power. We said we're not going to try to take over these Latin American countries, but we're kind of going to be their protectors, going to be their policemen, and we're not going to let Europe take over these countries again because we want to use them as our sphere of influence. Our sixth president was John Quincy Adams. Okay, you guys probably remember John Adams, our second president. John Quincy Adams was the son of John Adams. He was the one who actually wrote the Monroe Doctrine while he was Monroe's Secretary of State. And after Monroe left office, John Quincy Adams became the next president. He ran in 1824 and became the next president. And as president, John Quincy Adams, he kind of passively supported the idea of abolitionism. And that's really what most presidents did between Washington and Lincoln. Up until the Civil War, most presidents were kind of passive supporters of abolitionism. They didn't like slavery for the most part, but they weren't willing to kind of risk their presidency and put that in jeopardy in order to try to abolish slavery. So Adams was a passive supporter of abolitionism. What is abolitionism? Well, it was the movement at this time to end slavery in every single state. All right, so the Missouri Compromise was not about abolitionism. It was about compromising between where we will allow slavery, where we will not allow slavery. Abolitionism said we need to end slavery completely in every single state. And the motto of this movement was slavery is sin. It really attacked kind of the heart of American Christianity, saying that this is a moral issue, this is a religious issue. God is not pleased with us holding slaves, and therefore it must be abolished if we want to remain a Christian nation. You have one very prominent leader of the abolition movement named Frederick Douglass. You perhaps have heard of him. He was a former slave. He escaped slavery and became an abolitionist speaker. He actually wrote a really compelling autobiography that really exposed the evils of slavery that he was subject to when he was younger before he escaped slavery. Now, slavery was by far, and I mean by far, the most controversial issue at this time. Okay, really the most controversial issue ever in America. I mean, if you think of the most controversial issues these days, things like abortion or immigration or really any number of really controversial issues, things that divide us as a country, think of that times 10. Okay, that is what slavery was. Slavery was so incredibly divisive and so controversial. Everyone had an opinion about it. And pretty much if you wanted a civil discussion, you just didn't even bring it up because you knew that whoever you were talking to is going to have a strong opinion about it. Andrew Jackson was the seventh president. He was from Tennessee, and he was the hero of the Battle of New Orleans. Remember the War of 1812, the Battle of New Orleans, the last major battle of the war. Okay, that's where he really became kind of a household name. That's where he became famous as the hero of that battle. He earned the nickname Old Hickory because he was said to be as strong as a hickory tree and immovable as well. Now, remember we talked about political parties. Okay, remember how Washington had no political party, and then at the beginning, the two major political parties were Federalist and Democratic Republican, which is neither modern-day Democrats nor Republicans. Well, Jackson was the first ever Democrat. He pretty much started the Democratic Party, which is still the modern-day Democratic Party. He was the first Democrat president, and from that point forward, the Democratic Party really formed off of the policies of Andrew Jackson. Now, during his presidency, Jackson had kind of a war with the banks. He very much disliked the national banks. He did not think that was good for the people or the economy, that national banks should have so much power. And he closed the national bank. He said the Bank of the United States is not going to exist anymore. And so he enacted it through Congress. It got passed very quickly, and he closed the national bank. And this caused a lot of small private banks to react to this by printing a ton of money. Now, if you know anything about what happens, in economic history, when you just print a bunch of money, it's never a good thing. It always causes inflation because the value of each dollar goes down the more and more you print. So this inflation led to the Panic of 1837, the Panic of 1837. And this really started a 6-year-long depression. This was really the closest we had come to something like the Great Depression of the 1930s, which we'll talk about after Christmas, before that point. Now, Jackson's decisions to close the national bank is really seen as an economic policy failure. Of course, he probably couldn't have foreseen what was to come. Okay, not saying it's all his fault, but at the same time, it is something that was seen as an economic policy failure that hurt a lot of Americans. And then, of course, there was the Indian Removal Act, okay, another negative thing about Jackson's presidency. Signed by President Jackson, this tragically forced tens of thousands of Native Americans off of their lands in the Southeast. Okay, so you had a lot of Choctaw Indians and Chickasaw Indians in Mississippi. You had Cherokee and Creek Indians in Georgia and Alabama and Tennessee and North Carolina. And you had Seminole Indians in Florida. And Andrew Jackson said, you know what, all this land, remember he was a Southerner, and he said, all this land in the South, prime land, we need to clear it of the Native Americans so that white settlers can settle there, okay, so that they can have plantations and grow our economy like that. So he forced tens of thousands of Native Americans off their lands in the Southeast. They were forced to migrate west of the Mississippi River, as you see in that map there, and most of them settled in modern-day Oklahoma. Okay, Oklahoma still to this day, I believe, has the highest percentage Native American population, largely because of the Trail of Tears. Now, most, as I said, were sent to Oklahoma along this Trail of Tears, and this was during the winter as well. And, of course, they're in covered wagons here. There's no heating. And because this happened during the winter, about 25% of the 18,000 migrating Indians died on this journey. One of the many reasons it's called the Trail of Tears, not only because they were forced off their land into land they didn't want, but also because so many of them died on the journey. And then came the Texas Revolution. Okay, the Texas Revolution of 1835 to 1836. If you've ever heard of Davy Crockett, he was involved in this revolution here. This is when U.S. colonists living in Texas, okay, which was a part of Mexico at the time, they rebelled against the Mexican government. They said, we don't want to be a part of Mexico anymore. Remember, Mexico had just recently broken free from Spain, and now Texas, a part of Mexico, wants to break free from Mexico. So they rebelled against the Mexican government, and President Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, he was the president of Mexico at the time. And one famous battle that was included in this war was the Battle of the Alamo. If you've ever remember the Alamo, that took place in modern-day San Antonio. If you've ever been there, you can still visit the Alamo. Now, Texas succeeded in this revolution. They succeeded in breaking free from Mexico. They won their independence, and they established the Republic of Texas. So if you see on the map there, the area in the dark green, this became the Republic of Texas. These days we know this as East Texas, okay? Modern-day cities like Houston, Austin, Dallas, San Antonio, okay? Most of the population of Texas, all right here in this newly created republic. This country was annexed by the U.S. a few years later, and then it became the 28th state. All right, so Texas used to be a part of Mexico, then it became its own country for about 10 years, and then it became a part of the U.S. Martin Van Buren was the 8th president. He came right after Andrew Jackson, and he was actually Andrew Jackson's vice president. So he was right in line with Andrew Jackson's way of thinking and policies, very supportive of that, and continued those policies and agendas after Jackson left office whenever he became president. Okay, so Martin Van Buren supported the idea of political parties. Remember, George Washington did not. He said political parties aren't a good thing. But as you see, every president since Washington has embraced the idea of political parties. And Martin Van Buren said that political parties are a good thing because it makes a country more democratic. So Martin Van Buren was very much a Jacksonian Democrat. That party, the Democratic Party, had firmly been established by the time he took office. And as I said, it still continues to this day. The 9th president was William Henry Harrison. Really interesting thing about him, he was president for the shortest period of time. He was our 9th president, and he was only in office for 30 days. He was only president for 1 month. And the reason for that is because during his inauguration, when he was sworn in as president, when he was giving his inauguration speech, he did so in the freezing rain. That happens in the winter. Inaugurations happen in the winter, and he was in the freezing rain, and he refused to wear a coat or a hat or gloves. Naturally, he caught pneumonia because that's a very poor decision to make, and 30 days later, he died of that. So just to think, if he had only worn a coat and a hat and gloves, he probably wouldn't have caught pneumonia and died, and perhaps he could have been a great president. Now, Harrison was the first president to die in office, sadly, not the last. So once William Henry Harrison died, his vice president, John Tyler, took the presidency. And he was the first president from the Whig Party. By this point in American history, the Federalist Party had kind of faded into obscurity. The Democratic Republican Party wasn't really around anymore. And the two emergent parties were the Democratic Party, still around today, and the Whig Party, which is not around today anymore. And John Tyler was the first from the Whig Party. And this was the party that formed in opposition to Andrew Jackson. They said that this was that he was not a good president, that he was too much like a king, tried to take too much power for himself, etc., etc. And so that's why the Whig Party formed. Now, they called him King Andrew because he had expanded the powers of the executive branch quite a bit, and he also vetoed a lot of bills, which means the president can veto something and then it doesn't become a law. So Whigs believed Jackson was trying to become an absolute monarch, which is why they formed in the 1820s and continued up to this point in the 1840s, and that is what John Tyler was. Now remember, he became president kind of by accident. No one expected him to become president. No one expected Harrison to die so early, so he was nicknamed His Accidency. The 11th president, and one of the most consequential presidents we've ever had, even though you may not have ever heard of him, was James K. Polk. Okay, our 11th president. He was perhaps our hardest working president. He worked so incredibly hard, hardly slept at all, didn't take a single vacation day his entire time as president. In fact, he worked so hard that after he left office, he was dead within 3 months. Some people say he literally worked himself to death. So he was president during the Mexican War, which we're about to talk about, and he gained a ton of territory for the U.S. If you just see the U.S. map, which we will see in a second, before and after James K. Polk, it's almost as if the U.S. doubled in size under James K. Polk. So much territory was gained under him. We actually stretched to the Pacific Ocean, and most of the territory we have today was acquired by that point. He was a firm believer in this idea called manifest destiny. Now, what was manifest destiny? This was the idea that it was the God-given right of Americans to spread out across all of North America, all the way to the Pacific Ocean, and that Americans had a divine right to settle and to own that land. Okay, so Americans did believe that God had ordained this entire area from east to west, okay, from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to the Pacific Ocean, meant it to be a part of the United States. All right, so if you look at this map at the top here, this is the original United States, okay, to the right, to the east. Then you have the Louisiana Purchase here in the light orange, okay, and all of this territory here in the dark orange and the light green, that was all acquired under James K. Polk. All of that territory, either through war or diplomacy, that was all acquired by him. Okay, and that was because he and most Americans believed in manifest destiny, the idea that it was our God-given right to stretch out to the Pacific Ocean. Now, one of the most significant developments of the market revolution was the cotton gin. Okay, you probably heard of the cotton gin. Some of you may even know that Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin, pretty well-known fact. But what you probably don't know is that if it weren't for the cotton gin, and if it weren't for Eli Whitney inventing the cotton gin, it's very possible that the Civil War never would have happened. And the reason why is because before the cotton gin was invented, slavery was actually declining in America. Okay, you had more and more slaves being set free. You had fewer and fewer people going into being, entrapped in slavery because it simply had lost its profitability. It was not nearly as profitable as it used to be back in colonial America. So slavery was kind of on the decline, and politicians were kind of breathing a sigh of relief because like, oh man, now we're not going to have to deal with slavery. This is awesome. It's going to die out over time. It's declining, and things are going to be good, and eventually everyone's going to be free. Then the cotton gin was invented, and this was an incredibly efficient piece of technology that made it profitable again to farm cotton. So after the cotton gin was made, slavery actually began to increase again, since cotton farming became so much more practical and so much more profitable. Okay, so once again, nothing that Eli Whitney could have foreseen. I mean, he's just a guy who made a really cool invention that worked really well. But the unfortunate, very unfortunate consequence of the cotton gin was that slavery started to increase once again, which of course led to America's greatest tragedy, the Civil War. The Mexican War occurred from 1846 until 1848. Okay, this, as you probably have guessed, was a war between the United States and Mexico, and it was caused by a dispute over the boundaries of Texas. The United States wanted all of what we now know as modern-day Texas, and Mexico wanted to keep what we now know of as West Texas. So President Polk, okay, he offered to purchase this disputed territory from Mexico. He said, hey, he explained manifest destiny to them, the idea that this land should be ours, and it was God's will that it be ours. And he said, hey, I will purchase this land from you. I'll give you a good price. But the Mexican government refused. They said, no, this is our land. You cannot buy it from us. You cannot take it from us. At which point James K. Polk said, all right, we'll do this the hard way. So Polk sent troops into the disputed territory, led by future President Zachary Taylor. He would actually be the 12th president. This war lasted 2 years, and it was a very decisive American victory. So because of that, the U.S. expanded her territory quite a bit in the modern-day Southern Plains area. So if you see this map there, the Southern Plains, really all of the Southwest was acquired for the United States because of the Mexican War. Okay, so this is really where most of the fighting in the Mexican War happened, right here, kind of on the border around the Rio Grande in central Texas. And the war ended with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. All right, now the terms of this treaty was that the U.S. agreed to pay $15 million for damages caused by the war. Okay, since the war happened partially on Mexican soil and the Mexicans lost, the United States said, all right, we're going to pay you guys $15 million to rebuild your infrastructure, kind of war reparations for your losses, kind of no hard feelings type of thing. And in return, Mexico was forced to give up 1/3 of their land to the U.S. So if you look on that map, everything in color used to be Mexico. And Mexico dramatically decreased in size because of both the Texas Revolution and then later on because of the Mexican War, both of which gave formerly Mexican land to the United States. So all of this included the disputed territory of Texas, okay, so what we know as West Texas, this area right here with like El Paso and Lubbock and Amarillo. It also included the modern-day states of New Mexico, right here, Arizona, California, Nevada, Utah, Colorado, okay. All of this territory was ceded, was given to the United States with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And the Rio Grande, okay, this became the new southern border, okay, the new border between the U.S. and Mexico. So the U.S. Went on to acquire even more land under James K. Polk. You have the modern-day states of Washington, Oregon, and Idaho, okay, what we now know of as the Pacific Northwest. Okay, cities like Seattle and Portland were acquired by this treaty with the British, okay, the Oregon Treaty of 1846. So thankfully, we didn't have to fight a war for that territory. We pretty much bought it from the British. And then purchasing and acquiring land is one thing, but filling it, populating it, is an entirely different thing. And one thing that led to rapid population growth and all of this newly acquired Western territory in the late 1840s was the gold rush. Okay, the gold rush, very significant event. Gold was found in California here, and this caused thousands and thousands of people to rush west, okay, to move west to try to get rich, right? They'd load up all their belongings, get their family into a covered wagon, and as fast as they could, they'd travel west to California and just dig and dig for gold and try to get rich because of that. All right, so that is why the bridge in San Francisco is called the Golden Gate Bridge. That's why California is known as the Golden State. Remember the Golden State Warriors, all right? That's also why the professional football team in San Francisco is called the San Francisco 49ers, because the gold rush was in 1849. Last thing here, you have 4 presidents leading up to Lincoln after James K. Polk. First, you have Zachary Taylor. Remember I said he was a soldier from the Mexican War, and right after the Mexican War, he became president. He ran for president, and he had actually never cast a vote in his life, which is pretty crazy to think about. He never voted, and then he became president in 1849. So he was known as Old Rough and Ready. And he actually died about 1 year into his presidency, and his vice president, Millard Fillmore, took office. So Taylor was the second president to die in office, and then came Millard Fillmore. Millard Fillmore was another one of those presidents who kind of passively supported abolitionism, was never willing to risk endangering his presidency by going out on a limb and actually advocating for abolition, but at the same time, he did not like slavery. Leading up to Abraham Lincoln, you see so many presidents that could have done something to prevent the Civil War, and they simply didn't. They simply were not brave enough to do that, did not want to risk their own reputation or presidency, and so they just let it go on and on and on. Franklin Pierce was the same way, the 14th president right after Millard Fillmore, another one who just let the slavery issue drag on. And by this point in the 1850s, it was very clear that we were headed towards some type of very large conflict if this didn't get solved, but no one really had the decisiveness and the courage to put an end to slavery, or to at least try to put an end to slavery. There were all these different compromises made, saying, okay, we'll give you a little, you'll give us a little, and slavery was never abolished. And like I said, because of the cotton gin, it was actually expanding even well into the 1850s. After Franklin Pierce came James Buchanan. Some people say he was the worst president of all time. If you look at like the most agreed upon lists, you have Abraham Lincoln as number 1 and James Buchanan as number 45 on a lot of lists. Several things about James Buchanan that were simply bad. He was just not a very good president. He was president during the Dred Scott decision, which is one of the most infamous Supreme Court decisions. Basically said that black people and slaves weren't actually people. Just really terrible, and it later had to be overturned. He oversaw the secession of a lot of southern states and didn't do anything to stop it. Basically, continued to catapult us towards civil war. Okay? And then, of course, in 1861, that is when Abraham Lincoln became president, and we will be talking about the American Civil War next week. All right, let me know if you have any questions about the U.S. from 1815 to 1860.